All right, welcome everybody. I'm really happy to see you this early in the morning after the party for API documentation. That's awesome. I'd like to be talking about documenting RESTful APIs with Spring REST Docs, and there's going to be a little introduction on that, like 1/3 of the talk, and after that I would like to tell you how you can add RAML to this whole scenario and why this could be useful. I'd like to be giving this talk along telling the story of the development of our own API documentation. Before we jump in, I would like to give you some context of where I come from. I work for a company called ePages. We are based in Hamburg, in Jena, and in Barcelona, and we are offering software as a service e-commerce solutions. So we target small and medium businesses. And you might not know ePages, despite we have quite a decent market share in Europe. That's why, because we sell mostly through resellers. So we have partners that sell our products under their own brands. And yeah, basically, that's why ePages is not known to many out there. When I joined ePages, I was assigned to a project that was to build a new e-commerce backend, a greenfield project where I started, and we are using Java technologies, Kotlin recently. It's a microservice architecture, and we use all kinds of Spring stuff in there. And one constraint that we had that is especially interesting in the context of this talk is the API first constraint. So we were to develop a backend that was not serving a UI only, but it's there as a primary feature of the product that makes the whole backend open, and that lets not only serve our customers through UIs, but we can also build new great things with partners. So that was the idea. That's also why we pretty early started thinking about API documentation, because we knew the API would be such an important part of our product. So we were thinking how to tackle that one, and we came across Spring REST Docs quite naturally. Like, we are pretty much using a lot of Spring stuff, and Spring REST Docs was new and interesting back then, and we liked it from the start. And mainly we liked it because it takes a test-driven approach to documentation, and this test-driven approach gives you nice guarantees in terms of accuracy of your documentation. I think many of you have worked with API documentation, and if it's disconnected from the code, it basically rots away. Like, it's hard to keep it up to date, right? So from this experience, we really liked the approach that Spring REST Docs takes, this test-driven approach where you can emit certain parts of your documentation generated in tests, and then you write handwritten documentation with Asciidoctor, which is quite a nice markup language that's easy to write. So that's the approach that Spring REST Docs takes: handwritten documentation that can use generated parts that come from the tests. Another interesting aspect was that we liked a tool that we would like to have a tool that integrates nicely with the way we test our REST endpoints in our services. Yeah? And the tool that we use is Spring MVC Test, or Spring Mock MVC. I don't know, it's like interchangeable names there. And Spring REST Docs really supports that really nicely. It supports different things as well, like rest assured, but we use it with Mock MVC. Can you still hear me? Like, I have the feeling, yeah? Pardon? Okay. Okay. Great. So I would like to introduce you to Spring REST Docs with a little sample project. I prepared something to walk you through how this usually works. I prepared an e-commerce application, of course. So it's a really complex business model here. We have a product that's basically a JPA entity. And it basically just has a name and a price, right? So it's really basic. And we also have a cart, and the cart is basically just a list of products, right? So we have a list of products, and then we have a total price. That's it. So nothing fancy there. regarding the REST API, you don't see a controller here. So for the product, so we use Spring Data REST to expose a REST API on top of this product repository. Just because I was lazy at that point. But I came up with a custom controller for the cards resource. So we have a controller for the cards resource, and this can do 4 things. It can create a card with a parameterless post. It can get a card by ID. We can order a card, like place an order out of a card. And we can add products to it, right? And adding products is done, like it's in Mathias hypermedia-based API, so we can post product URIs to this endpoint, and then this URI is used to look up product entities, and these are assigned to the card. So also pretty straightforward API. And now we're interested in the tests, right? So that's where the documentation is supposed to be coming from. So let's look at that. As I said, we use in our test the mock MVC framework. And basically in mock MVC, who knows that? Who's worked with that? All right, so almost everybody. You basically, it's centered around this mock MVC object. You can auto-wire that with Spring Boot test help. And then you can use this object to make requests. Like, let's look at this should get card. So we need a card with a product first in order to retrieve it. So that's what we are putting into this test fixture here. We're also using the REST API to prepare our fixtures. And then we go use the mock MVC object to perform a get on this endpoint. And we get back a result actions object that is basically just there to add assertions now, right? So you can use that as a Fluent API. So I could just go and put my assertions directly after this request. But I'd like to do it a little bit differently. I'd like to have this separated in the test. So the assertions come here. So we can check status is OK. I have a certain response structure. So great. We have an API. It's working. The test proof it's working. It's all nice. But who can use this API, right? It's not approachable. We don't have an API documentation. So let's add that. Let's add Spring REST docs to the game. And what do you usually do in Spring when you start something new? Any guesses? Put annotations, right? So auto-configure REST docs is the annotation that we need here. It gives us sane defaults for the REST docs configuration. You can do it differently with JUnit rules and setup methods, but this is the most convenient way. And now all we need to do in the most basic form is register a result handler. So we go and we pass a result handler here. This result handler is given by Spring REST docs. It's called document static factory method, where we can just pass an identifier for the operation that we want to document, right? So that's it. I do that for all my tests where I want the documentation. To card get, and last but not least, card order. And once we have that, let's see what that gives us. So let's run the test, let Spring REST docs do its work and look at what's generated. Test is green, that's good. Didn't mess up here. And now we see a new folder here in the build folder, generated snippets. That's where Spring REST docs puts the generated parts of the documentation, and we get a folder here that's basically this identifier that we specified. So we get a bunch of files there. It's all just, we didn't provide much information, right? It's just this identifier. So all Spring REST docs knows at that point is the request and the response that was flowing, and nothing more. So it can basically just derive that information into different forms, and it does that by, for example, here having an Asciidoctor source snippet that is telling us how to do this request in curl. We also get it for HTTP, which is a much nicer command line REST client. We also get it in HTTP notation, and we get a sample request body, which is empty, response body. It's all wrapped in an Asciidoctor source code block, right? So this is quite a lot that we get by just putting a result handler. It was not much work. But we can do even better. And this I prepared as a separate branch, just to spare you some looking at me typing. So things will happen here. So you see now that this document method became a little bit more complex, right? It was a little bit more effort. We can register, despite the identifier, we can register snippets. That's basically just a snippet is a way to document a certain aspect of a request, right? So here we document the response fields. And when we start doing that, we have to document all the fields in that response, right? So we give what Spring REST Docs calls a field descriptor. That's also all done by static factory methods. Field with path, so there's a field at total. That's a JSON path expression. They can be more complex, as you can see here. And then you can give a description, like you tell what this field is all about. Okay, and for links, basically the same. Like we have links in our response, and you also need to document them. Let's see what happens when we execute the test again. It's the green, and there should be some movement in this folder here. You see now we get 2 new files. We get a response fields Asciidoctor table that is basically just the information that we gave, like the JSON path and the description, but also an inferred type. This is inferred from the JSON response, right? It looks at the JSON and it can tell the JSON types of that field in the response. Same for the links, so we get tables there. And now we have quite a decent amount of information in these generated snippets, and now we want to put it together to a service documentation. So that's done, as I mentioned, by handwritten parts. So I put my handwritten documentation in source docs AsciiDoc. That's the default location. And then, yeah, there you go. So this is basically my entry point to the API documentation. It's a plain Asciidoctor file with some header information. We won't go into details there. And we have some includes, and I choose to separate the different resources in different files just for the sake of overview. So let's look at the cards. So we have all the 4 resources that I put here, or that are endpoints that are documented. For everyone, I have a heading, and then I use something that's called operation, right? This is an Asciidoctor macro that Spring REST Docs provide. It's just there for convenience to help you not having to include the same files over and over again, which gets a little tedious, error-prone, and annoying. So we have this macro where you can say, okay, please include the snippets for the operation called cards create, and then please include the snippets called HTTP request and HTTP response. And for our get card, we had more snippets, right? We want to also include the request, the response fields, and the link snippet. Okay. Now I have to look one thing up. I think I made a mistake. No, I didn't. Great. So great. There's Asciidoctor, and now we want to see something shiny, right? So we want to see some HTML, and that's REST Docs uses the Asciidoctor Gradle plugin to convert these Asciidoctor files into HTML. So we can just go and call Gradle W. Asciidoctor. And the Asciidoctor task depends on the test task. So first all the tests are run, and once that's done, we have all these snippets generated, and then it goes over the source docs AsciiDoc folder and converts it to HTML. And now in build AsciiDoc HTML5 index HTML, we see a new file, which is now my API documentation in HTML format. So we see here we have the cards, and we also have the get card with an example request, example response, response fields, and links. Right. So that was, I think, quite a quick thing. I forgot my favorite feature. Right. So I will jump back to the code and show you something else, which is the last point of this little introduction. These response fields aren't just there for providing documentation information. They are also assertions, and that's really nice. So I said it gives you, Spring REST Doc gives you much in terms of accuracy of your API documentation. So let's do one thing. Let's say I document here a field subtotal, and by doing this, I do 2 things. I document a field that doesn't exist in the response, and I forgot to document the total field, right? So the test will now fail on me. This is expected. And Spring REST Docs tells me nicely that the following parts of the payload were not documented, the total field, right? And it also tells me fields with the following path were not found in the payload, subtotal, right? So whenever I evolve my API, I add new fields, I change field names, I remove fields, my test will start failing if I forget to update the documentation, which is really nice. So you have pretty strong guarantees that your documentation is accurate. You can still forget to document resources, but yeah, that's what Spring REST Doc doesn't cover. So this is really nice from my point of view, and we just went with that, right? So we put that into place for all our services, and then we were trying to get a public API documentation out of it. And there were quite some challenges on the way to a public API documentation from what we have seen now. And I picked 3 examples that I really find interesting, and hopefully you find them interesting as well, of problems that we needed to solve. First, any pages, we have a bunch of tech writers that are really great, and they help us to make technical written documentation and text in general that we publish just high quality, right? So developers not only write good text, so they help us to improve that a little bit. But with this model that we have just seen, with putting these descriptions in the tests all the time, we spread all these texts across all our test code, right? And it's quite a bit of test code that we have. And we don't want our tech writers to have to scramble through all these tests and find these places. And they actually also didn't want to tamper with source code files. So they said, okay, I'm afraid to break things, and I don't find my way around. So we helped a little bit by externalizing descriptors. So we took these descriptions out of the tests. We invented a new factory methods for these field descriptors, where we just have a JSON path and a field or a key for a descriptor. And then this descriptor is loaded from a file. And this file also resides in this source docs folder. So we now have a folder that the tech writing department is responsible for, right? They own this code in this directory, and we can also notify them about changes. So yeah, you see here's only the description, but we can actually every property of the field descriptor we can put in this YAML file. Good. One thing solved. The second problem was something that I didn't really see coming. It is like if you have tests that generate documentation, then your test data is suddenly public. And I think developers are sometimes they are funny with test data, sometimes they are lazy with test data, but seldomly they are. It's something that you really want on your public developer portal. So we came up with a test data catalog, a YAML set of test data that you can use to pull in and use it in your test. And we can also use this test data set to provision it to a real shop on our live system, so you can actually see responses in the API documentation that you can actually play against the real shop, a test shop, and then you get similar data back than your tests give. So that's quite a nice side effect of that. Interesting thing, like as I said, we are working in a microservice environment, so I have many services that contribute to the public API documentation. And in the end, we of course want one documentation to present to the user, right? He shouldn't see that aspect of microservices. So we need to do some work in order to aggregate that back into a single API documentation. And we use our CI, or continuous integration and continuous delivery infrastructure for that. What we do is, like on the left-hand side, you see a bunch of services that we have. Like we have more, but these are just examples. And every service that emits public API documentation builds a separate jar in the build phase. Whenever we merge to master, we would do that. And we would put the source docs AsciiDoc folder into the jar, and also this generated snippets folder. So everything AsciiDoc regarding API documentation is going in that folder. And we would then, in the continuous delivery pipeline, where we deploy to production at the very end, we would download all these jars for the services that are relevant. We would extract them, and then we have a top-level Asciidoctor file in a separate repository that pulls these parts in and aggregates an up-to-date API documentation of what we just deployed. So it's also this accuracy is not lost. We were really paying attention that we don't lose these guarantees of accuracy because we are not playing nicely in the deployment process. So whenever something's deployed to production, we also update and publish this API documentation. Okay, so these problems solved, we were then really having a first achievement. We had a documentation on our developer portal, right? So that was a nice moment. I'd like to show you just what we came up with. This is the API documentation so far. To be honest, it's really just an API reference at the moment. We are lacking some process descriptions, some use case descriptions that walk you through some common use cases. It's really just a listing of resources that we offer, and there's quite a bit of them. And also, by the way, if you'd like to play around with that API, here's a link to sign up for a shop and for a test shop and work with that. So basically, you would be getting there from our developer portal, and then Docs Beyond API is where I was just looking at. So that was nice. So we had a good starting point to actually work with partners. We could exchange knowledge about our API with partners. That's great. But we had the feeling that this is not enough. Like we had the feeling we wanted to go a little bit further. We want something that is a little bit more nicely. What we've just seen, it's pragmatic, it's full of information, but it's not, right? It's not picking you up, is it? Like it's a little bit more appealing. Like we wanted something that is a nice appetizer to directly start using our API. So we had the feeling we need something that is interactive, right? Documentation where you can look at informations about the resource, but at the same time start interacting with the API right away, play around with it right away. And this is something that we had the feeling we couldn't achieve. And basically this is because we have in this Asciidoctor approach, we are mixing information and markup, right? So we always have these Asciidoctor snippets. And it's hard to process that any further. Of course, Asciidoctor can process it or transform it to HTML, but like really parse it and do something else out of it, it's really hard. So yeah, we had the feeling that with the Asciidoctor and Spring REST Docs plain approach, we're not getting anywhere beyond static HTML that I've just shown. So we had the idea, what if we had a machine-readable API description, right? Something that's more abstractly describing our API. This would be awesome. And then, surprise, there's already something like that. There's RAML, and we can use it. And we actually had some expertise in the house already about RAML, so we just picked it up. We didn't really look at competitors. There are tons of them out there, like OpenAPI and API Blueprint are, just to name a few. And RAML is RESTful API Modeling Language. It's basically YAML-based specification to describe requests or to describe a REST API. It has two versions of specification, 0810, and usually these MuleSoft is behind RAML, right? And usually these companies, they try to offer a whole life cycle of tools around APIs. So we are just focusing on the documentation phase, right? They do tons of stuff on top of that. The simplest example of a RAML file is this. So you basically have a little header block here where you can give a title and also some other top-level information about the API. And then comes the resources part that just lists the resources. You can also hierarchically list them, right? Nest them. And here we have just the greetings resource that exposes the get method. Responses are always 200. That's at least what the documentation says. That's nice. So and the body would be application JSON. It would follow that type information. The types can be something called RAML data type notation. That's part of the RAML specification. It's a YAML-based data type description format. But it can also be JSON schema, right? So this is a little bit more widely known, I think. And the example can also be, it can be YAML or it can be JSON, right? So just to get an idea of what we are talking about, it's a very basic example. Okay, there we were. We wanted to go to this RAML-based approach, and we wanted to keep our benefits that we already had, the things that we liked from Spring REST Docs, this test-driven approach, these guarantees in terms of accuracy, and we were not finding anything that helps us there, so we were building our own open source project called Docs RAML that was solving that. So with that, we can keep everything we like from Spring REST Docs, and at the same time, we can get a RAML description of our API. Good. So this is a screenshot from the repository. It's living under the ePages -de organization. Docs RAML is its name. Here's the screenshot of the README file. So there's quite a bit of documentation there. There's also links to the Gitter chat to start interacting with us. Yeah, so I would be really happy if you would pay a visit to that repository and even try it out. But to make sure you get a glimpse, I would show you something with that Docs RAML now. I would like to use our sample project in the state that we left it and add Docs RAML to it and get RAML out of it, and then show you how great it is to have a RAML-based description of your API. Good, so let's continue here. We had, as I said, we had tons of these tests, just like this one, quite a large code base, and then we wanted to introduce Docs RAML, and then we said, okay, this is quite a bit of amount of refactoring that we need there. It's quite tedious and it's quite boring. Let's invent something that's a little bit smoother, right? And what we came up with is, oh yeah, by the way, I already have the build set up here. Maybe we look at that in a bit. I would just jump directly into the code for that. So we have tests like that, and to refactor that test to also apply Docs RAML, we have to do just one thing. No, it's not putting in a annotation. It's deleting the static import here and bringing in a new one. So we just bring in the RAML documentation .document, which is coming from Docs RAML, and that should be already it. So if I just run my test again, we will see what it additionally gives us. Actually, this new document method, it's something like delegating to the old one, but it's also introspecting all the information that we have in the snippets. It's extracting these field descriptors and trying to put them into another snippet, our own snippet, right? So this RAML description of a resource is caring about a lot of aspects, right? It needs path parameters, it needs query parameters, it needs to have knowledge about request fields, about response fields, about headers, all that. So, and usually you scatter that into different snippets in Spring REST Docs, and we get all this information, everything that we can get hold of in this snippet block, and put it into our own snippet. We will see that a little bit better in the next step. But first, let's see what it gives us. And as I promised, it looks a little bit similar to what we have just seen, right? It's the same snippet still there, and we have some new files on top. So we have this RAML resource.raml file, which is a RAML representation of this particular resource. It's not a real valid RAML file, it's just a fragment. And it's basically just describing that resource. It's looking at the response it found, and it just puts all the information in here. We have an example from the response that we recorded, and we also have, because we have this response fields block in the documentation or in the test, we will get also a schema file. So we take these field descriptors and generate a JSON schema out of it. Okay. So this is the first step in applying Docs RAML. So just swap out an import would be one way. If you are if you are on a new project, then you might want to do differently. You might want to go with Docs RAML right away, and that's also possible. Then you could just use our snippet directly. Right? This is the snippet that would be emitted in the version that we had before transparently for you by getting all the information from the call that you made. So here we have a RAML resource snippet parameter object, because now we can put very much information in it. So we came up with a builder to help you to just specify what you have, because all the parameters are optional, but you just put what you have, and then we go with that. So at the moment You can give description, you can tell us if it's a private resource or not. You can give request fields, response fields, links, path parameters, request parameters. And as I said, all these are optional, and here we just picked a few to generate that. All right, so now we have this new snippets, right? So every test now emits also, on top of what it already emitted, a RAML fragment. And now we want to have one RAML file built out of it, right? So we need this aggregation phase, very similar to what Asciidoctor did by picking up all these, by including all these snippets. We now look at this generated snippets folder, get all the fragments, and try to build a API RAML out of it. Let's see that in action. So Gradle, the task is called RAML-doc. So that's also depending on the test task. It would run the tests, get all these RAML fragments, and then do its aggregation work. And once we did that, there should be a new folder in the build folder now. There it is. And we get a top-level file called API RAML. The name is customizable. We just went with the default here. And this is how it looks like. It gets some title information or some header information. Where does that come from? Right? I didn't show you the build setup, so let's jump to the build Gradle. And there's a little bit of an extension here that helps you customize certain aspects of this file. You can do more. It's just the basic stuff that I put here. You can look at the documentation for what you can do else. Followed by this header block, we have all the resources, and there we just list the first path part. We extract and we kind of structure our file a little bit by includes. This helps us to aggregate in the end multiple API RAML files again into a big one, right? Now we have many API RAML files for different microservices, and then we still need to aggregate that back into one at a later point in time. So with that structure, it's really easy, right? You know, you just need to pick these resources and put it into a bigger file, and then you have it. So the structure is a little bit due to a better aggregatability later. So then we have our cards RAML, and now we see all the resources that our card offers. So a post on cards, the get on cards/ID. We have a post on cards/ID/order, and cards ID products. We can post to add products to it. So so now we have a RAML file, so that's great, isn't it? So I think it's only great if you can do something with it, right? So let's look at a little bit. I'd like to take you on a little tour through the RAML tool ecosystem to tell you what we can do with this RAML file, right? So let's start with a tool called RAML to HTML. Guess what it does? So basically going back to where we came from, right? This HTML representation. It's an NPM project that is provided by MuleSoft. So npm install RAML to HTML will give you that. We specify our RAML file, and we tell it what the output should be. There you go. Is that readable for you in the back? Yeah? Fine. So we can see it on one screen. So yeah, that's it. It gives us a nice overview of our API. I think it's a little bit nicer and a little bit more appealing than Asciidoctor, right? So at least that's my feeling. It gives a nicer overview of what the API offers, and you can jump in to the resources. So let's see the card get that we have played around with all the time. So it gives us the methods that are available for this path, and then we get a little bit detail for that resource. So request is not very interesting, it's a get, right? So we just have the URI parameter that's documented here, and the response is that. So the response will just give me now the media types and the type information. So we get the JSON schema here, and then we get some examples here. Okay. One thing that I'd like to show you, a nice feature of RESTdocs RAML with this, that I want to show with this HTML presentation, is that sometimes you have different variations of resources, right? You offer a resource for different content types. You respond with different status codes. You sometimes have also data structures that are either this or that. For example, we have a shipping method entity, and this shipping method can have a fixed price or a weight-based price. So it's either or. It's the one or the other. So you can't document that in one test. You have two, and then you have two examples of that test, and maybe you even have two schemas. And by the way, we will merge these schemas with RESTdocs RAML. So if you have these two tests for the same resource, we would give you the multiple examples for the request, and we would merge the JSON schema, so you will have come up with one schema for that. And as an example for this, I have the products patch here, because RESTdocs RAML gives us multiple patch endpoints. It gives us, not RESTdocs RAML, Spring RESTdocs gives us multiple versions of patch. It gives us JSON patch format, and it gives us the possibility to patch with plain JSON. And I have tests for both, and now I would like to see that in the documentation as well. So you see here, request, it says, okay, the body can be either JSON patch, JSON, and then there's a schema for the JSON patch format, which is not complete, and it shouldn't be there, right? This is a specification that you should read up. You shouldn't put this type information here. And you have an example for this request. And then followed, like there's also application JSON, and we can use something like this to patch it. Right? In the response, I have done something. I've added a documentation for an error case. Right? So I have not only the 200 cases, but I also have provoked a constraint violation, and I have documented that as well, because the constraint violation has a special format, so it should be in the documentation. We see here, now we have documentation for the 400 case, for the bad request case, and we can see how this error structure looks like. Right? So I think RESTdocs RAML does quite a good job in aggregating different aspects of the resource by pulling in different fragments and making it quite concise in the documentation here. And I think this view here in RAML to HTML is quite nice. Okay, the second one is called API console. It's actually something that we were keen on to have. Like, it's an interactive console of the API. You can build it and then directly play with your API. It's also an NPM tool, also provided by MuleSoft. So it goes something like this. Oh no, I need to go to a separate folder. I prepared something. This API console, it consists of two phases. First, you have a build command that can take the RAML file and then generates a web project out of it. That takes quite some time. Like, it's doing all kinds of downloads there, downloading the internet probably, I don't know, but it takes forever. So I prepared that for you. So we just need to go API console, serve, and then the folder that the tool generated for us. And once that's there, oh, damn it. I forgot some cleanup here. Oh yeah. So there you go, it's up and running. What I also need to do to play around with the API, I need to start my project. Spring Boot, boot run. And now let's play around with that with the help of the API console. Right, that's it. So it also gives us a nice overview of the resources that the API offers, and we can jump right in and say, okay, let's see if there are products. There shouldn't be any because we're using in-memory database. It gives us a form for the query parameters that we're not interested in at the moment. And we see no products in the database. Let's create one. So we go here. Oh, already created. I wanted to show you, like, the body is, like, they take the example, put it into the body, so you already have something that you can start with. But of course, you can also change that. Create another product. right? So now you should have 2 products. Where are we? There. Awesome. Now let's create a card. Card is basically just a parameterless post without a body. So here you have a card. It has the ID 1, and we can now add products to this card by posting to the product sub-resource. Here it tells us, right, you have a path parameter here, a URI parameter, that we will need to fill in. So there's also a form for that. We put the ID that you have seen, and we also put the body. Here you see we are posting a list of URIs. It's a line-separated list of URIs, so it works in a way that you just, if you want to order a product twice, you put it twice into this URI list and send the request. And there you go. You have 2 fancy pants and 1 fancy shirt in your card, and then you can go ahead and order this. The nice thing is it remembers the, I think it does it by name, like it remembers the last value for this URI parameter that you put. So you still have the ID 1 here, and there you go. So I think this is quite an approachable way, like you make your API interactive, and you could also choose to like deploy this as part of your static resources of your application, right? You could also serve this API console directly from your application, which would give you really nice experience for the user. So while the user is at it trying to use your API, you can just jump into this API console, make requests against it. Okay, I personally like to use Postman when I interact with APIs. Who's using Postman as well? Like, yeah, the majority, right? There's some using Paw or Insomnia or something like that. I still like Postman. It's the most powerful one. So wouldn't it be great if you could import that RAML file into Postman and make a collection out of it? That would be quite nice, but unfortunately, Postman doesn't support RAML 1.0 yet. So we have to, I found a way the other day to do it. It made me quite happy. So I used a tool called API-matic. It's they offer API portal or the API documentation portal as a service. Quite a nice thing. You upload your RAML file or Open API file or API blueprint file, and they generate a portal out of it. Quite an amazing thing. And they also have a transformer, so they can transform from all these formats into all these formats, which is quite amazing. So now you're not only having everything, all the tools that RAML gives us, but you can also use all the other tools. That's quite nice. So yeah, let's try that. Let's try that out. So one thing I need to do first is to zip my RAML directory, because we have this includes and have so many files. We need to upload a zip file here. So I'm creating an API.zip, put everything in. And now I go and use the converter by uploading this zip file I just created. And I choose Postman to 0 as a target format, and that would now give me a new file. It's converted number 5. Okay, so I can import this file here. And there you go. Now I have my collection of the complete API, and I can also start directly playing around with it here. So posting against the cards resource obviously works. Getting my products also works directly straight away. So this is also an opportunity, I think, to get a Postman collection out of your API documentation is quite a nice thing to do, because usually developers build their own collection, right, for your API because they want to try things out. Okay, so that's for the demo. We're already at the conclusion, so I hope I got across that RESTdocs RAML is quite a neat extension to Spring RESTdocs, that it's really easy to get it in, and that it gives you quite a lot of benefits for a very low effort, right? So you can at least leverage the complete toolchain of the RAML ecosystem. And as I just showed, you can even go further and transform it to different formats and leverage the tools from other ecosystems as well. So that's quite a powerful thing. I would be really happy if you would go from here and try it out in your projects. You can start with a sample project that I've used here that's available on my GitHub profile. But you can also directly go to Docs RAML project, and here's also a sample project in. This is like a sub project here, and this sub project is also a sample for Docs RAML, and it showcases a lot more functionality than in this sample project for this presentation. So yeah, this would be a great entry point. And if you have feedback, and I'm really keen on getting some real user feedback and see what's working and what's not. And if you have some feedback, please go to the GitHub chat that's advertised here and drop me a line. Really helpful to get this out. Like, we are using this ourselves at the moment. It's deployed to all our tests, but of course it would be great to know how it, if it also works for others. Okay, that's it. That's all I have. As I said, drop me a line on GitHub if you have opinions on the project. Also, you can drop me a line on Twitter, and also the ePages developer account on Twitter would be a good place to drop us a line. Right, thanks for coming so early in the morning. Thanks for your attention. If you're having questions, I think we have 2 or 3 minutes.
Hello. I would like to ask around 2 or maybe 3 questions. First of all, does it somehow cooperates with Spring Cloud contract verifier? Because in that project you can specify a contract, and based on this contract there are auto-generated tests for your API. Is it somehow correlated with this?
No, it doesn't. Like, we're not using Spring Cloud contract, but it's an interesting idea. Like, it's something that we maybe can look at.
Okay, and can any of those forms like RAM be used at component testing during contract testing between components? For example, by packed.
I didn't get that question. Can you repeat, please?
Okay, so from my point of view, this module is somehow correlated with Swagger. Yes, and Swagger gives you all of those things like the console and the HTML file, and also ability to test your API during contract testing automatically. So does this ASCII form or RAM form enable you to execute contract tests by packed?
At the moment, not. I think we have, at ePages we have a different Docs RAML extension that's supporting YAML. So it's doing something different than Spring Cloud Contract and emit YAML stubs from your tests. But yeah, that's all at the moment. So
okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Hi. Question is, so as my colleague said, Swagger enables you also to use this API testing live. And do you know if there are any plans for RAML and this view to support trying out the API without this open API, or without this API console?
You mean automatic?
Yeah.
Yeah. As I said, like, RAML has this whole tool chain of supporting you to ramp up mock service from your RAML files to support your testing. They have tools for that. I didn't really look into that too deeply, but I know they have that. But I also know that they are having some commercial offering regarding that. So I'm not sure what's free and what's not. But they might have some support. At least I know they have a mock server that you can come up with, and they might have more. Like each of these API descriptions, like Swagger's Open API or API Blueprint, they all have like a whole lifecycle tool chain around their specifications.
Thank you.
All right, anyone else?
Hello. I wanted to ask for suggestions on how to document workflows within your API. You know, you have to call this get and this post and such things.
Yeah, I think if you document processes or use cases to walk users through something common like creating a cart, adding products and placing an order, that's something that you probably would like to handwrite, right? So our plan is to have this as handwritten documentation, and this handwritten documentation could then point you to this API reference part where you have the Spring REST docs documentation or something that you generated out of your RAML file and describe the resource in more detail. So I think I can't think of a way to automate that. Right, so that's it. Thank you very much and have a nice remaining day here.